And so in order to not create conflict or controversy, you will modulate some of the things you say. And this is out of self-preservation, because so often senior pastors, preaching pastors are attacked, and oftentimes they're attacked by people in their own church. And so it's difficult on churches, and it affects a pastor because his livelihood comes from that. It can be threatened. And anybody who owns a business, anybody who's in sales, anybody who is a CEO or started a company understands this. There's nothing nefarious about this incentive. It's just the way it is. And that's one of the things I love about the Salty Pastor, is that all those incentives are completely removed away from me now, because I'm going to do this whether thousands of people listen or nobody listens. It doesn't matter, because I feel the Lord has just called me. And so sometimes I may feel like I'm a voice crying in the wilderness, or maybe I'm like Peter in the book of Acts and thousands of people will listen. I don't know, because I am just simply doing this out of faithfulness to what God has called me to do. Welcome, everybody, to the Salty Pastor Podcast. I am Douglas Peak, and I am your Salty Pastor. Just so that you know, if you're joining us for the first time, the Salty Pastor Podcast is now its own standalone platform, the Salty Pastor Ministries, and we are falling under a 501(c)(3) nonprofit. So anybody and everybody who joins the Salty Pastor crew and becomes a supporter of this ministry can make tax-deductible donations. We would appreciate your support. Also, if you go to our YouTube channel and you like and subscribe, or you can check us out on the web at thesaltypastor.com. Anything and everything is helpful, and it allows this platform to continue to grow. And why should it grow? I mean, the reason why, I believe, is because people are looking for answers to their faith. And this entire platform is all about helping you grow in your faith. It's giving you the tools in order to mature your faith. It gives you the techniques to think for yourself so that your critical thinking skills grow. It shows you how to deconstruct bad arguments and construct better arguments. It shows you how to move from someone who is easily manipulated through emotional reasoning to someone who is based in what I call faith reasoning, which requires wisdom, experience. It requires knowledge of revelation and truth, objective truth. It requires critical thinking skills. It requires logic and rationality. So when you're thinking with your faith mind, life is completely different. And that's what this is all about. It's a podcast for people who want to grow their faith, think for themselves, and they realize, look, fluff is not enough. I need deeper answers to the biggest questions in life. And so that's why we are doing the Salty Pastor Ministries, and that's why I believe this platform can be a regular part of your spiritual discipleship. Now, we are currently in a series titled The 7 Deadly Emotions. And for you to just be brought up to speed, quick review, and that is in the 3rd century, like 280 something around there, AD, after Christ died on the cross. Evagrius Ponticus was a scholar. He was an early church father, a theologian who then became a monk. And he came up with the idea of 7 deadly sins, and he did this as a counterpoint to Aristotle's 7 virtues, which were reflective of what Paul wrote to the Galatians in Galatians chapter 5, called the fruits of the Spirit. So what we did is we thought, well, because today we've moved from the revelatory man to the economic man, now to what is known as the psychological man era, and we then package these 7 deadly sins as emotions, because our society has taught us to think about and value our emotions above all else. And so because of that, just thought, okay, well, then this might give us insight into how these emotions can enter into your life, plague your life, undermine your faith, and ultimately they're deadly. And so we're dug into that. The first one was anger and how destructive it is, fear and anxiety, then despair or sadness, boredom, which is sloth, guilt and shame. Oh boy, that's a big one. Last week we did envy, and this week we're going to do number 7, and that is lust. And so, what exactly is lust, and what does the Bible teach about it? Well, according to Felicia, she's got a tough last name, by the way. Felicia Masonheimer, she wrote the following: a lustful mind is more focused on its desire than on the consequences of that desire. It is irrational, both sensual and insensitive, which I thought that was a really fascinating way to say it. It focuses on the sensual, but it is insensitive. Lust is focused on satisfying a want that it perceives as a need. And it essentially says, in this area of my life, I am God. I will decide the best way to fulfill or satisfy that need or desire. So I think that there's some really insightful stuff there. And it talks about how lust is something in your mind, okay? And it is focused on the satisfaction of desires. Now, that's a whole nother discussion. I mean, we could spend probably 3 or 4 podcasts just on notion is where does desire come from? Because on one hand, C.S. Lewis makes the argument from desire as the existence, as a proof of the existence of God. So are all desires bad? Well, no, especially if they point to the existence of God. However, why is it that lust uses our desires in a way that kills instead of brings life? See, that's a great question. And we might be able to address some of those things. But the issue is desire. And it's in our mind, and it uses our desires. And it becomes irrational in its approach to satisfying those desires. And that's really the key. So let's jump into the scriptures real quick, and let's talk about probably the most famous story in the Bible that deals with lust and its impact. And it is found in 2 Samuel chapter 13. Now, before I read this story, I want to give you a little bit of background, okay? And the story has to do with Amnon, and Amnon is one of the sons of King David, okay? And it has to do with a daughter of King David by the name of Tamar. Now, what's really important to understand is how the royal family operated. And that is David had 5 wives. And he also had, I think it was like 14 or 15 kids amongst these 5 wives. And so what happened is they were half brothers and sisters, same father, different moms. And what happened is each of these families, moms, would be apportioned a part of the house or the palace, and this was like their wing or their family place. And so it's important to understand is that the king had his own quarters by himself, and then his wife would have an entire portion of the palace that was dedicated to her and his children by her and their servants and their entourage and all their loyal people. So they would see each other at events and the times when the king would gather them together, but they wouldn't necessarily do business with each other because they also saw themselves as competitors. Who would be the next heir? And so it was a lot of political intrigue. There was a lot of, jockeying for position and favor for the king and so forth in these family environments, particularly these royal family environments. And so it is in this environment that the story of Amnon and Tamar happens. 2 Samuel chapter 13, beginning with verse 1. Now, after this, Absalom, the son of David, had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar. And Amnon, the son of David, loved her. And Amnon was so frustrated because of his sister Tamar that he himself made himself ill, for she was a virgin, and it seemed hard to Amnon to do anything to her. So just so that you understand in the culture here is that she was of the age in which she could be given of marriage, but she was a virgin. And therefore, she was required to keep herself pure until she was given in marriage, which made it very difficult for Amnon to start any type of illicit activity with her. Verse 3. Now Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shimei, David's brother. So if you remember, David had like 5 brothers, right? And if you remember, Samuel, the prophet, went and anointed David as the next king of Israel, and his older brothers were passed over. So it seems that the historian writing this is pointing out the fact that David's brother Shimei had envy, and we talked about what envy does, even amongst family members. And so he had a son named Jonadab. Jonadab was a very shrewd man, or clever, I think is another way to interpret the Hebrew here. Verse 4. So he said to Amnon, O son of the king, why are you so depressed morning after morning? Will you not tell me? Then Amnon said to him, I am in love with Tamar, the sister of my brother Absalom. So Jonadab then said to him, well, lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill. When your father comes to see you, say to him, please let my sister Tamar come and give me some food to eat. Let her prepare the food in my sight, that I may see it and eat from her hand. So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill, and the king came to see him. Amnon said to his father the king, please let my sister Tamar come and make me a couple of cakes in my sight, that I may eat from her hand. Then David said to the house for Tamar, saying, go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him. So you kind of see the reference here that Amnon is in one house, right? And Tamar is in another house. So he sends to the house of Absalom, who was the firstborn of the kids in that house, okay? And so what happens is he says, go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him. So you got to go to this other place. So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, and he was lying down. She took dough, kneaded it, made cakes in his sight, and baked the cakes. She took the pan and dished them out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said, have everyone go out from me. So everyone left. Then Amnon said to Tamar, bring the food into the bedroom, that I may eat from your hand. So Tamar took the cakes which she had made, brought them into the bedroom to her brother Amnon. And when she brought them to him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, come and lie with me, my sister. But she answered him, no, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. As for me, where could I be rid of or cause to go of my reproach? And what she's saying here is that you will destroy me and my future. And as for you, you will be like one of the fools in Israel. In other words, if you do this, it will destroy your standing in the house. Now, therefore, please speak to the king. He will not withhold me from you. Now, this is what she's saying. Is she's saying, look, don't do this because it is bad for you and it's bad for me. All you have to do is ask the king and he'll give me to you in marriage, okay? However, he would not listen to her, and since he was stronger than her, he violated her and lay with her. Basically, what he did is he overpowered her, and she was raped by him, okay? Then Amnon, after he rapes her, it says Amnon hated her with a very great hatred. The hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, get up and go away from me. So this happens immediately after he rapes her. He then now hates her more than he ever desired her or said he loved her. She said to him, no, because this wrong and send me away is even greater than the other that you have done to me. Yet he would not listen to her. She's saying, you raped me, and that's horrible, but by sending me away, that's even worse than what you just did to me. Because what it does is it shows that she was unacceptable even after he raped her. It's a terrible thing that he did. Verse 17, so he calls to his young man, this is his attendant, who attended him, and said, now throw this woman out of my presence and lock the door behind her. So he throws her out. Now she had a long-sleeved garment, for in this manner the virgin daughters of the king dressed themselves in robes. Then his attendant took her out, locked the door behind her. And Tamar put ashes on her head, tore her long-sleeved garment, which was on her. She put her hand on her head and went away, crying aloud as she went. Then Absalom, her brother, said to her, has Amnon, your brother, been with you? Because just the fact that her garment was torn and she was wailing, he knew what had happened. She'd been violated. She'd been raped. He said, keep silent, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this matter to heart. So Tamar remained and was desolate in her brother Absalom's house. Listen to that. I mean, her life was desolate after that. It was completely robbed of any of her future. Every dream, every hope, everything that she desired in her life was completely taken away from her. She was made desolate, okay? And then it goes on to say, now when King David heard all of these matters, he was very angry. He was super angry, but he didn't do anything. Absalom did not speak to Amnon either good or bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. And it came about after 2 full years. And then he goes on to tell a story. I won't read it. It's all the way to the end of the chapter. But basically, what happens is it says he had sheep shears in Baal-Hazar, which is near Ephraim, and Absalom invited all of the king's sons. So he has sheep shears. They're out there shearing his massive flocks, and he invites all of the sons, so his half-brother Amnon, and while he was there, he kills Amnon. So he wreaks vengeance upon him. Now, this is one of the most famous stories of lust and how destructive it is. Let me recap a couple of the biblical principles from this story. Number one is lust always hides under the positive emotion of love, right? It says that he loved her so much, he made himself ill. So he had what, let's just say, for benefit of the doubt, he had a love for her, a positive emotion. Number two, David's brother, Shimei, had a son, Jonadab, and it seems like the brother of David was envious. And so his son gave bad counsel. So this is a side note, and that is, be careful who you take counsel from. One of the most important things is that if you're going to let people guide you or lead you, you have to ask them, what is their incentive? What is their incentive? One of the things that I really like about this new journey that I'm on, this is kind of a side note, is that the salty pastor has basically zero incentives now. So what it does is it allows me to say exactly what needs to be said. It's not beholding to anybody. Sometimes, and I found this in myself, I'm not talking for other pastors, but I know other pastors this way, is that sometimes what you have to do is you have to be careful because of what you say, particularly when you're preaching. It's difficult because what happens is people take what you say and misconstrue it all the time against you when you're a senior pastor or preaching pastor. And so in order to not create conflict or controversy, you will modulate some of the things you say. And this is out of self-preservation because so often senior pastors, preaching pastors are attacked, and oftentimes they're attacked by people in their own church. And so it's difficult on churches, and it affects a pastor because his livelihood comes from that. It can be threatened. And anybody who owns a business, anybody who's in sales, anybody who is a CEO or started a company understands this. There's nothing nefarious about this incentive. It's just the way it is. And that's one of the things I love about the Salty Pastor is that all those incentives are completely removed away from me now, because I'm going to do this whether thousands of people listen or nobody listens. It doesn't matter, because I feel the Lord just called me. And so sometimes I may feel like I'm a voice crying in the wilderness, or maybe I'm like Peter in the book of Acts and thousands of people will listen. I don't know, because I'm just simply doing this out of faithfulness to what God has called me to do. And I've talked about this before when I went out, that now that I'm retired, there's no incentive to do it other than to help people be coached up in their faith. Now, back to the main point is the third thing. When a good emotion is influenced by lust, like the first point was, lust always hides under a positive emotion. And so when a good emotion like love, this guy had love for Tamar, is influenced by lust, it affects good judgment. Look at verse 11, right? When she brought them to him to eat, he took hold of her hand and said to her, "Come and lie with me, my sister." Verse 12, she answered, "No, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing." So the first thing it does is it removes his good judgment, and this good judgment is damaging for both parties. Verse 13, she says, "I will be under reproach and you will be considered a fool." And so isn't that interesting? Lust always hides under positive desires, positive emotions, but what it does is it affects your judgment and how to satisfy it. Instead of doing it the right way, you end up taking a shortcut and doing it the long way. And what it does is, when you satisfy a desire in the wrong way, it not only hurts the person that you're trying to get that satisfaction from, but it also hurts you in the process. It reminds me of what Paul told the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18, where he said, "You should flee sexual immorality, because every other sin that a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body." Now, it's really important to understand the context, and that is that when you have a practice of sexual immorality, and that's what he's addressing, because there were people who called themselves Christians who were regularly going to the fertility goddess there and having sex with the temple prostitutes. And because of the influence of Gnosticism, it was like, well, no big deal if I do it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't affect my faith. And he says, well, actually it does, because you're doing something, practicing something on a regular basis. Now, this is different, and that's just very important, from somebody who says, well, I made a mistake here or I made a mistake there. And that's for another discussion, but I want to point that out because it is very critical to understanding the main point, and that is, when you have a good emotion but it's tainted or twisted by lust, it kills things and gets you into a habitual process of hurting your soul. This is why sex addictions are so wounding to the soul. This is why pornography is so wounding to your soul. So that's important. Number 4, lust ends up killing all good emotions, especially love. When lust uses the emotion or desire to be loved and to be intimate and to connect, and then lust points you to fulfill or satisfy that desire in an irrational way, it ends up killing the fulfillment of that soul desire or thirst that you had. Because look at verse 15. Once he did what he did, it says he hated her more than ever loved her. And that switch flipped just like that. And that is so interesting, is what lust did is it immediately killed any good emotions he had for her. So even after he raped her and violated her, he hated her so much, he couldn't even stand to have her in his presence. And then finally, it's really interesting, is that when King David heard about it, he didn't do anything. And why is that? Well, that's because if you go back and you look at chapter 11, just 2 chapters before, that's when Bathsheba and David got together. And then chapter 12 is when Nathan the prophet rebukes David for his sin. And isn't that interesting? So I think part of it had to do with guilt and shame. So here is ultimately the deal with lust that we need to understand before we figure out on Thursday how to address it, deal with it, face it, conquer it, and not let it kill anything in your life. And that is this, is lust is always deadly, but the real question is, what does it kill? Well, what lust does is it kills the beauty, the purity, the wonder of all the other positive emotions in your life. And it ends up producing nothing but guilt and shame. And it's guilt and shame that caused Amnon to hate her with a great hatred and not even be in her presence. So that's what guilt and shame does. That's what lust produces. Therefore, the question then becomes, how do you then deal with lust? And we're going to dig into this more on Thursday in a practical way, but I want to just give you kind of an overall perspective real quick to think about over the next few days. And it's this. Well, lust has always been an issue and talks about it in the scriptures. And so there's kind of on a pragmatic level, basically 2 ways that we have sought to deal with our lust in Christianity. The traditional approach was basically deny your desires. And this became known as a ascetic lifestyle, right? And there was another earlier approach, and it started out about the beginning of the 2nd century AD, so about 110. So not quite 100 years after Christ died and rose from the dead. And it was known as Gnosticism, as a Greek philosophy. And I'll talk a little bit more about it. But what it did basically is it said that anything spiritual is good and anything in the material world or flesh is evil. And you can't redeem the material or physical world. So you just want to be all in the spiritual world. And the way you get there is through knowledge. And the Greek word for knowledge is gnosis, starts with a G. And so gnosis is where we get Gnosticism from. And so it was a split, a very hardcore split between spiritual and the material or physical world, also known as your flesh. And so there were 2 approaches. One approach was ascetic, and that as well, it's not just knowledge that gets there. I don't want my knowledge to be tainted, so I'm going to deny my flesh and my desires at all costs. So you lived a very ascetic lifestyle. Then there was the other side of Gnosticism, and that was, well, since your fleshly desires can't ever be, fixed because they're always innately evil, you need to be in the Spirit. So if you think about the Spirit and you walk in the Spirit, what you do in the flesh is irrelevant. And so that became very hedonistic in its orientation. So the entire issue here had to do with Gnosticism in the 2nd and 3rd century. And what happened is people lost the understanding, particularly Paul's teaching, that Jesus is not calling us to reject our desires. He is trying to redeem our desires and free them from the taint of lust, which is sin. So Jesus didn't only come to redeem us spiritually. Paul talks about how he came to redeem our current life, our current flesh, so that we are no longer a slave to sin, but we can be free from it in our desires, in our emotions, in our thinking. And that's why I do the Salty Pastor, so people can be free from all the things in the world that kind of is stopping them, burdening them, holding them back, affecting them in a negative way. Because oftentimes it's not what you're thinking, but how you're thinking about it. And that is, if you're not thinking about things about your life from redeemed emotions or redeemed desires or even a redeemed mind, then you tend to come to bad conclusions, which just keeps the cycle and downward spiral happening in your life. But if you can live in a way that you see, man, Jesus wants to redeem my desires as well as my thinking and as well as my emotions, then it gives a whole new perspective and take on it. Now, I'll dig into this a little bit more, but I just want to conclude with a simple notion that proper thinking is the first step in understanding and overcoming the effects of lust in your life. You want to understand how to think about lust and how lust preys upon your good emotions and it produces bad desires. And what you want to do is, well, let me rephrase that. It's not that it takes your good emotion and your good desire, it warps that good desire into a bad desire in the way you choose to satisfy it. Do you catch the difference there? It's very important to understand that your desire, for instance, for sexual intimacy with another person is a good desire. It's a part of God's image in you. Before the fall, he said to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply. Well, what do you think he was talking about? That's exactly right. Sexual intimacy. He was talking about emotional intimacy. He was talking about spiritual intimacy. So he's talking about all of these things. So that desire is a good desire. But what happens is the choice, if lust chooses you to take a shortcut in how to satisfy it, then the desire becomes tainted, and then that leads to a negative outcome in your life. And so that's why Jesus is in the business of redeeming your desires. So proper thinking is a first step in understanding it and overcoming the effects of lust in your life. And so it's more important to not just try to deny the desire. It's important to embrace the good desire in your soul and then understand how it's been warped or tainted by lust so that you can get rid of the lust and redeem the desire. And that's how your faith is the thing that overcomes any obstacle in the world today. What is the victory that overcomes the world? It's our faith. Not faith in the world, not faith in things, not faith in ideas, but faith in Jesus Christ, the living Son of God. So, with all that being said, I'm going to sign off today for the Salty Pastor. I hope you're encouraged to understand how Jesus is wanting to redeem your desires and emotions. On Thursday, we're going to dig deeper into this. So, if you'd like to become a supporter of this ministry to just keep it going, love your support, you can click on the link in the description and you can go directly to find out the address to mail a check to, or you can give directly through the giving portal. The link will take you to it. And if you'd like, you can also even use that number. Just text GIVE. It's super easy. It allows you to become a regular supporter of this ministry, and every little bit helps. So thank you for being with the Salty Pastor today. And remember, think for yourself.